Good day and hello again, choral arranging class. Got some new material to cover today, and after I cover this new material, I've got some assignment work for you to do this week. And in order to do the assignment work this week, I'm really hoping and trusting that you have received some graded homework from me in the mail this past week. Because part of the next assignment is going to be to make some corrections to the part writing and the rhythmic elaborations that you sent me for RLE. We can talk a little bit more about that at the end of this lecture, but otherwise let's go ahead and get started. We're going to continue talking about three-part arranging today, and last time we talked about some homophonic textures for three-part arrangements. Today we are going to talk about a new homophonic texture, which we have not talked about yet this semester. And we are also going to talk about one of the contrapuntal textures in three-part arrangements. Now, frequently an arranger desires to highlight a melody in a single voice part, relegating the remaining two voices to background harmonic support. In this situation, the melody most frequently occurs in either the soprano voice or the baritone voice, so that the other two adjacent voices, such as the alto and baritone if the soprano has the melody, or the soprano and alto voices if the baritone has the melody, but so those other two adjacent voices can easily be paired. In this case, the background voices are usually marked softer in dynamics than the melody line, and they are given short text fragments derived from the text of the main melody, or they are given a neutral syllable. And generally the rhythm of the supporting or background vocal lines move in longer rhythmic values than the rhythm of the main melody. So let me go ahead and bring an example up here on the screen, and I'll point out some of those things that I just talked about. This example has been used in several chapters prior to the one we're in right now. It is called Winds Through the Olive Trees. We have looked at certain measures, certain passages of this piece before, but I don't think we've looked at this particular segment of this arrangement before. Anyways, let me go ahead and back up and restate again some of the characteristics or features of three-part arrangements where you have a melody line in one voice and then background vocal texture in the other two voices. Okay, so we talked about how in this texture that the melody line is most frequently either in the soprano voice or the baritone voice. You can see from this example on the screen that the main melody has been placed in the baritone voice in this three-part example. Okay. Therefore, the other two adjacent voices are relegated basically as background harmonic support. And they're easily paired here. You can see, first of all, some characteristics about these. The dynamics for these background voices, the soprano and the alto, are marked piano, where the dynamics for the main melody and the baritone is marked mezzo forte. Another characteristic about the background voices that I mentioned just prior to this is that they move in slower or longer rhythmic values than the main melody voice does. So they're softer, they move in longer rhythmic values, and also I mentioned that usually the background voices are given short text fragments derived from the text of the main melody or they are given neutral syllables. Neutral syllables. Well, you can see in this example, the soprano and alto background voices are not given neutral syllables. They are actually given some text that comes from the text of the main melody. Now, if you can't read it from your vantage point, the main melody in the first phrase reads, "Then from the happy skies, angels bent low." So what text fragment is taken and used from the main melody and used in the background vocal parts? Well, the last three words, actually, "angels bent low," those are used for the softer soprano and alto lines. They have saying, "angels bent low, angels bent low." Now, before I leave this text topic, I do want to mention, and this is helpful for future projects, that if you ever use a text fragment derived from the main melody, your text fragment really should form a complete thought in order to use it. I would not use a text fragment that does not form or make up a complete thought. I think "angels bent low," that makes up a complete thought. We have a picture, there's a subject, there's a verb, it makes sense to us. Whereas if we said something like "angels lowly," well, that might not be as great. In fact, let me go ahead and see what the lyrics are to the bottom side of this, or the next part of this example. So it appears that some of the text in the next phrase is "long, long ago." Perhaps an even better example of what not to do if you're using a text fragment is to say, "angels long." That doesn't make as much sense as "angels bent low." It's not a complete thought as "angels bent low" is. So again, the point is, if you use a text fragment for your background voices, for their lyrics, for their text, see if you can use a text fragment that forms a complete thought. Otherwise, neutral syllables are fine, such as "ah" or "ooh." A couple other features or characteristics about this type of vocal texture. Again, we call it a melody line or a melodic line with background vocals. That's the name. And by the way, this is a new homophonic texture that I've not talked about this semester before. A couple other features or characteristics here. Each part in this background vocal texture is usually simple, so that, for instance, this line, the soprano line, is rather simple, and so is the alto line. And it is intentionally written that way so that when they're put together, the two lines, the background lines, do not overpower or distract from the main melodic line. One other piece of information, feature, or characteristic that is helpful to know about this vocal texture: harmonically speaking, the background voices have chord tones. They have primarily chord tones. Sure, you may be able to use a non-chord tone in there, here and there, but primarily, and for the most part, the notes that are the soprano and alto are singing in this example for the background vocal texture are chord tones. Another way to say that is that the tones that the soprano and alto are singing probably come from some of the pitches that are played in the piano accompaniment. In other words, you can find in the piano accompaniment a B flat that the altos are singing. Maybe not in that exact register, but you can find a B flat there. And the sopranos in the first measure are singing a D. And again, you should be able to find a D in the first measure of the piano accompaniment. So in a way, even though it might not be the exact same register, we would say that the notes used in the background vocal texture are consonant, they are primarily chord tones, and they generally duplicate the pitches, some of the pitches that are used in the piano accompaniment. Alright, let's go a little bit deeper into this example. As I mentioned, the main melody is placed in the baritone voice, and the top two voices have the background vocal texture. The background vocal voices are used as supporting voices. They are not the primary or main voice at this point, but they are supporting voices. And Well, I should also say that as I zoom out and go to the next four measures of this example, by the way, this example is found on page 132 in your textbook. This is example 9.5. Let me zoom out or go to the next four measures of the example and see how the texture of these four measures here changes. In the second phrase of this example, you will notice that the baritone voice no longer has the melody. The baritone voice in these four bars has been relegated to a background or a supporting voice. The melody in these four bars has actually been transferred up to the soprano voice, and we have that listed right here. Now, what type of texture, or how is the alto voice complementing the melody in the soprano voice? Well, it appears that the alto voice in these four bars has been given a note against note texture to couple or complement the melody in the soprano voice. And once again, the baritone voice is your background voice. It is moving with longer or slower note values. It is softer dynamically, and it uses a text fragment taken from this very phrase, the text from the main melody of this phrase. One other thing I'll mention about this example before I go ahead and play some of it on the keyboard for you. I would like to let you know or show you that the notes of the baritone in this phrase only, but the notes of the baritone actually duplicate the fundamental bass notes that are found in the left hand or the bottom voice of the piano. We may have, I believe I talked last lecture about how not always, but sometimes the baritones, that is a voice range deep enough to be able to duplicate the fundamental bass of the chosen harmonies or chords of the entire accompaniment, of the entire arrangement. So here we have in the piano the fundamental bass is a low G and then a C and then an F and then a B flat, and that's exactly what the baritone voice is singing as it sings its text fragment, again in slower rhythmic values than the melody and in a softer dynamic than the melody. Alright, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to go to the keyboard and play, first of all I will play just the three vocal parts, both phrases. First phrase is measures 1 through 4, second phrase is measures 5 through 8. And then after that I'll go ahead and play the piano accompaniment so you can kind of hear how that supports and complements what the voices are doing. So let me start with the three vocal parts. Hopefully you can see it well enough from where you are sitting from this video camera to be able to follow along. So here are the vocal lines. And next I will play a little bit of the accompaniment for you so you can hear how that goes. So once again, this is that new homophonic texture that we have not discussed before. It is called melodic line. It's a homophonic texture referred to as melodic line with background vocal texture. So three-part arrangements frequently feature a counter melody to create a contrapuntal texture. So moving from the homophonic to the contrapuntal or the polyphonic texture, one way that arrangers create the polyphonic or contrapuntal texture in a three-part arrangement is to incorporate a counter melody. Now, let me go ahead and remind you for a moment here what a counter melody is. I know we've talked about it before this semester, but it doesn't hurt to have the definition kind of fresh in your mind. A counter melody is an independent line that sounds against a melody and that maintains separate pitch and rhythm and contour, and that is predominantly consonant with the main melody. If you need a repetition of that definition, just go ahead and back your recording up a few seconds and listen to that again. Now, in three-part vocal textures, there are two general ways to incorporate a counter melody. And I'm going to go ahead and let you know what both of those are, but I'm going to take one at a time. So I'm going to define the first way to incorporate a counter melody in a three-part texture. And then after I'm done explaining that and teaching all of that, and then also playing this example here, which is example 9.6 on page 133, then after that, then I will go ahead and talk about the second way to incorporate a counter melody in a three-part arrangement. Okay? So let's just focus on the first way right now. And again, example 9.6 on page 133 is, I believe, a good example of this first way. Alright, so a good way, the first way to incorporate a counter melody in a three-part arrangement is to present the counter melody in a single voice line, while the other two voices are paired note against note with the main melody occurring in the upper paired voice. Okay, let's pause and unpack that a little bit. So first of all, we have to identify in this example, what is the counter melody, where is the melody, what kind of textures do we have, which voice gets what. Well, first of all, I can tell you that the baritone line is given the counter melody in this example. This example is called Sing Noel and Beat the Drum. And again, the counter melody in this case is given to one voice. In this case, it happens to be the baritone. And we have the main melody is actually paired with another voice in a note against note texture. So it turns out that the main melody is, well, at first it looks like it's got to be either in the soprano or the alto voice, because these are paired together in a note against note texture. Well, it turns out that out of the soprano and the alto voice, the main melody is in the upper of the two. It is in the soprano voice or highest voice. And maybe you know the main tune or the main melody that's found in the soprano voice here as Michael Row the Boat Ashore. I know the tune that way. Do, mi, sol, la, sol, etc., etc. So once again, we have counter melody in a single voice, here it's in the baritone, and we have the main melody in the soprano, and it is being coupled in the alto, or complemented, with a note against note texture in that alto voice. All right, let's talk about what is going on a little more specifically in the baritone voice. If you can see this clearly from your video, the opening four notes of the baritone voice give away what its melody is. It starts out with the tones of joy to the world, but after the first four notes of joy to the world, it starts to do its own thing. Either way, at any rate, the baritone voice has a counter melody. That's its purpose here. And let's talk about the pitches that are used in this counter melody. Would you suspect that most of the pitches would be consonant or chord tones, or would you suspect most of them to be non-chord tones or maybe dissonant, tones that do not belong to the harmony? Well, if you suspected the first option, you would be correct. The notes of the counter melody are generally, again, primarily chord tones that are consonant with the notes of the melody and that fit in the harmonies of the piano accompaniment to go with that melody. Okay? So primarily chord tones that are consonant with the main melody. Now, let's talk about the text for what to put with the counter melody. The question is, what kind of text can I assign to the voice that has the counter melody in this texture? And the answer is, it can again be either a text fragment, or it can be a neutral syllable, such as ah or oo. In this particular example, we have a text that is actually a text that is not necessarily taken from or derived from the text of the main melody. This text, as you can see, starts out joy to the world. Okay? But again, whenever you use or assign a text to a background voice or to a counter melody voice, you want to make sure that your text fragment forms a complete thought. It's hard to overstress that. The text of the soprano and alto is the text of the main melody itself, so there's really not a question of what needs to be used as the lyrics there. So, what I would like to do, as I did with the last example, is first of all go to the piano and play just the voice parts of this example, and then after that I'll go ahead and play the accompaniment that goes with the example, and hopefully, because I can't play all of them at the same time, hopefully you can hear how the two will blend and complement one another. So this might not be the easiest for you to see from your vantage point, but at least the sound will give some clarity to this example, especially if you're looking at page 133 and following along in your textbook. So first, the vocal parts. Next, let's listen to the accompaniment for this example. let me move to the second way to incorporate a counter melody in a three-voice arrangement. Here we go. The counter melody may itself be paired in a note-against-note texture with one of the other voices, while the remaining or third voice is assigned the main melody. So, whereas before, in the first method, we had the counter melody by itself, and then two voices were paired together, one of which had the main melody. Here we kind of have the reverse. Here we have the main melody in a single voice, in this method, and the counter melody is actually paired with another voice, generally, again, in a note-against-note texture. So if we look at this example 9-7 in your textbook, it is called Garden Song, and hopefully when you look at it in your textbook, you can deduce that the baritone voice has the main melody in this arrangement, whereas the counter melody is actually a combination or a note-against-note texture between the soprano and the alto voices. The soprano and the alto voices. Even though it's not exact, I would say, especially when we look at the rest of this example, I would say that the texture is essentially a note-against-note texture. Now I know it's not exact, especially in measure 2, but for the most part, the soprano and the alto are working together in a note-against-note texture. Speaking of now, talking about the text, okay? The key words or phrases from the original melody are assigned to the counter melody voices, but a neutral vowel sound could also be used, or just a neutral syllable, that could also be used. So in this particular example, we have the text of the main melody in the baritone says grain for grain, sun and rain, and then whatever it says after that. We'll look at that in a minute. Notice that the text for the counter melody, the note-against-note pair, or combination of the soprano and alto voices, uses a text fragment from this particular phrase. They're singing grain for grain. And to me that is, again, enough of a sufficient of a complete thought to use as a text fragment. Now, do you have to use a text fragment that's derived from the main text of the melody? And the answer is no. You can use a neutral syllable such as ah or oo, again, in the paired counter-melodic voices. Whereas the notes of the main melody and the baritone are basically chosen for us because of the melody itself, the notes that are chosen for the soprano and the alto lines in this example, once again, are, because they are subordinate lines, supporting lines, still counter melody lines, but most of those notes, again, will be chord tones. They will be consonant with the harmonies that the piano accompaniment is furnishing for this arrangement. And again, not too many non-chord tones, not too many dissonances, although you can have some. But again, primarily chord tones, and I would suspect that many of the notes that are sung by the soprano and alto in this particular example would be duplicating or doubling some of the pitches that are coming from the piano accompaniment. So I'm going to play this example. For this example, I'm going to just play the three vocal parts. It looks to me like the accompaniment, the keyboard accompaniment for this arrangement has 3 staves. So I'm guessing that it was originally arranged for organ accompaniment, which I don't have on campus, unfortunately. But I'll go ahead and zoom out so we can see the majority of this example. And by the way, the example goes on to the top of the next page. And I'll do my best to play the 3 vocal parts so you can hear the main melody in the baritone and the counter melody paired between the soprano and the alto. Again, very small, not ideal for viewing necessarily through the video, but hopefully you have your textbook open to pages 134 and 135, and you can follow the voice parts along there. I do happen to personally like the syncopation in the rhythm, particularly in measure 2, but more likely I like it better in measures 4 and 5, and then I also like it in measure, looks like 7, going into measure 8 as well. So that's where I'm going to stop teaching new material for this lecture today. I do need to save a few minutes at the end of this lecture to talk about where we are headed as we go through this class. Next lecture I will be talking about the remainder of the contrapuntal textures for 3-voice arrangements. But in the meantime, I need to get you started on knowing the information for what you're going to be doing for your next arranging project. This will be the second arranging project. And what I will do is I'll put the document that I have for this second arranging project up on the screen, and I'll also send it to you through Canvas. We'll talk a little bit about it here, but once you get it in Canvas, you'll be able to read all the details on your own, just to get an idea now of what the next project is going to entail. So basically the second project is going to be to take the melody Choral, which we have been working on a lot this semester, and arrange that melody for soprano, alto, and baritone voices, in other words a 3-voice texture, with piano accompaniment. I give you a lot of detailed instructions here under the project summary heading of this handout. I won't necessarily go through all of that right now, but let me go ahead and slide the page up so you can see at least a graph of the format of what I want our next project to look like. So, Choral basically consists of 4 4-bar phrases, kind of like the last melody we used for a project. And those 4 4-bar phrases are diagrammed on my chart with these solid slurs. They are the central 4 phrases, each of which is 4 bars long. What I would like you to do as part of this project is to add a piano intro. No voices for the piano intro. Hopefully about 4 measures or so, just piano only. And then at the very end, I'd like you to include an ending that will be for the voices and the piano. And part of this assignment includes the intro and the ending because we did focus on that since our last project. And so I'm hoping that the intros and the endings will be not necessarily a little more substantial, but a little more thought have been put into them now that we know a little bit more about them this time around. The piece is in the key of B flat major all the way throughout, so you will not need to modulate. I list some cadences that you should suggest that you should use at the ends of your phrases. Notice that most of these cadences I have abbreviated as AC, which means authentic cadence. You may use perfect authentic cadence or imperfect authentic cadences as you see fit for those. However, there is one cadence where I want you to use a PC or a plagal cadence. And when you look at the harmony of the third phrase, towards the end of that phrase, you'll see why that cadence will be plagal. I'm going to ask you to use 2 vocal textures in this second project. The first vocal texture will consist, or it will actually span the distance of the first 2 phrases. And then the last 2 phrases are going to use a different vocal texture. And for the first 2 phrases, I'm going to ask you to use the vocal texture that I just talked about at the top of this lecture. A melody line with background vocals. For the last 2 phrases of this project, I would like you to use a note against note texture in all 3 voices. All 3 voices. Okay. When you get to the ending, the vocal texture can be either of the 2 that you used prior in your project. In terms of the piano, for the piano intro, you can use basically any rhythm, but use a chordal or a chordal or an arpeggiated style throughout. In fact, throughout the entire project, I'd like you to either use chordal accompaniment, or I'd like you to use arpeggiated style accompaniment. And specifically, when you get to the body of the arrangement, for the first 2 phrases, I would like you to choose either chordal or arpeggiated style, but I want you to choose one of the rhythmic elaboration patterns that we talked about and we worked on last week. Okay? Then for the second 2 phrases of the body of the arrangement, I'd like you to choose a different rhythmic elaboration pattern for those phrases. Now, just so you know, if it's not obvious, these elaboration pattern 1 and elaboration pattern 2, they are going to be, you're going to derive the rhythmic pattern, but you're going to get those rhythms from your good part writing, the part writing that you're going to correct for your next homework assignment, the part writing that you already started for RLE. Once you have that correct and in tip-top shape, then what we'll do is we will take those notes exactly where they are in the voices in which they're found, and we're going to rhythmically elaborate them so our piano accompaniment has good part writing to it. Just a few things on the back of this document. Again, I will send this to you through Canvas. For the background voice parts in the first 2 phrases, I want you to provide a neutral syllable, such as ah or oo, rather than some kind of text fragment. Then when you get to the second 2 phrases of this project, since it's all going to be note against note texture in all the voices, I want you to use the same text for all the voice parts in those last 2 phrases. This time around, in terms of final preparations, you will obviously not be handing in to me a hard copy of your arrangement, but I will be asking for you to send me a file of your arrangement, an electronic copy, so to speak. And once again, this project, you can either do the project and write it neatly by hand, or you can use some kind of music notation software. Okay? There are some details here. Whenever you're done with your project, you'll send it to me electronically. And currently, what I have thought out and planned for the calendar is that you can. The due date for this project will be about 5 p.m. on Monday, April 20th, 2020. So if you are watching this video on Monday, April 6th, for example, which is probably a good time to watch this video, the project will be due 2 weeks from that day. So it's 2 weeks from Monday, April 6th, and that date should be Monday, April 20th. The last thing I will show you for this lecture is just a little bit about the beginning of my arrangement according to the instructions that we just talked about for the second project. You can see that I have a 4-measure piano-only introduction. Okay. The piano introduction is derived from the body or the main melody of the arrangement. You can see the tune goes ya da 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 da, ya da 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 da. Okay. Also, I would advise you, although you don't have to do this, but I think it's kind of a nice touch. You notice I end on a tonic chord or B-flat major chord on the downbeat of measure 4. But then I quickly go to a dominant or a 5/7 chord at the end of the measure. I think it can be very appropriate to close your piano introduction at the very end with a half cadence, with a 5 chord or a 5/7 chord, because it sets up the entrance to the 1 chord when the voices come in the next phrase. And so the last thing I'd like to show you today is a little bit about the textures that are going on in the first phrase. A few moments ago I had just said that we're going to be using for the first 2 phrases of the project the melody line with a background vocal texture. So this is my opening phrase here, measures 5, 6, 7, and 8. And this is the beginning of my next phrase, which is the same texture. But I put the melody in the baritone voice. I gave the baritone voice louder dynamics than I gave the background voices. I gave the background voices neutral syllables, just as I instructed a few moments ago. They are softer in dynamics than the main melody. And notice that the rhythm of the background voices, which are paired in basically, I mean it's not exact, but basically a note against note texture. Notice that the rhythms are much slower. Longer rhythmic values are used compared to the rhythm values of the main melody so as not to overshadow or obscure hearing the main melody. One last thing I might mention about this opening phrase. I decided to use a chordal accompaniment style, for the first few phrases of this piece. And my chordal accompaniment style rhythm, the rhythm I've got, the elaboration I got, has been taken straight from static correctly part-written chords. And I've just taken one of the rhythmic elaboration patterns that we discussed last time, and I've implemented that. But again, all the pitches, their exact register, octave, placement, and everything comes from the good part writing that I used beforehand, and which you will have beforehand before you go ahead and add a rhythmic elaboration pattern for your piano accompaniment. So as I get ready to go, I do want to let you know that your next assignment, which will be due Wednesday, I believe that's the 8th of April, your next assignment is going to be to fix any of the part writing errors or any of the rhythmic elaboration errors that I marked on your homework from last week, which has been sent to you in the mail. Again, I'm crossing my fingers that you have received that. And again, your next assignment for Wednesday will be to correct the part writing errors, and if you had any rhythmic elaboration errors on that RLE assignment. And I want you to rewrite your part writing errors. Don't rewrite the errors. I want you to rewrite your part writing correctly based on the errors that I showed you. And then I want you to resubmit that. And your rhythmic elaboration, the same thing if you needed to do some corrections on that. I want you to send that for Wednesday, April 8th. And again, I will put all the details as much as I can think of on Canvas for you to follow. Until then, I hope you have a good week, and we'll see you next time.